have been nice, he may have been a powerful prophet, but he's not God. The fact that he died and rose again proves that he was who he said he was. And that is and has always been the major focus of the church. His birth was not as an important an event as that was. So, why? I just mentioned that. Okay. So the big question that's going to take up most of this time is, when was Jesus born? When was Jesus born? Yes?
I think it was like 7 BC.
We'll see. Just follow where I'm going with this. Because the Gospels give us clues to all of this. By the way, there are only 2 of the 4 Gospels that record anything of Jesus' birth. This again tells us that the fact of Jesus' birth was of less importance than his death and resurrection. All of the Gospels record the last week of Jesus' life, day by day by day by day. We know more about what happened to Jesus, what he did from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday, than we know in the 30 years that he was here on earth. We know more about what he did day after day that week than we know about anything else about him. That tells you something about all 4 Gospels. It tells you that the early church said this is the importance of Jesus' life. This is by which he came. This is the focus through which he came. This week, all 4 Gospels, without fail, tell us exactly what he did. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Easter Sunday. All the rest of the gospel is leading up to that week. In fact, the majority of each of the gospels is focused on that week. So the fact that we have anything about Jesus' birth is really quite extraordinary. And the only 2 Gospels are Matthew and Luke. Mark records nothing. Mark's Gospel begins with John the Baptist preaching and then Jesus appearing. Already starting his ministry. No birth, no childhood story, nothing. He's just here. That's Mark's Gospel. John's Gospel begins, in the beginning was the Word. Okay, takes us back to that. And the first appearance of Jesus is when John the Baptist says, "There's the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world." That's it. No birth, no anything. It's only Matthew and Luke that tells us anything. And interestingly enough, it's both Matthew 2 and Luke 2 that tells us anything about his birth. And I want to focus more on Luke's Gospel about this. Because Luke's Gospel is where we get the majority of our information about Christmas and anything about Jesus' birth and childhood. The first 5, the 5 joyful mysteries of the Rosary are only found in Luke's Gospel. No other Gospel. None. The fact that we have 5 joyful mysteries is because of Luke's Gospel. Okay? None of the other Gospels record anything about the Annunciation, the Visitation, finding Jesus in the temple, any of that. It's all in Luke's Gospel. Only Luke's Gospel. Well, Luke's Gospel says this: "In those days a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be enrolled." This was the first registration that was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Now, we're familiar with this, right? This is the taxation thing that Caesar Augustus decried, and that's what got Mary and Joseph out of Nazareth and into Bethlehem, right? Because that's what the next verse says. Verse 4, "Joseph went from Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David." Now, if you read Matthew's gospel, you'll see exactly how Joseph is related to King David. You will see his complete lineage from David all the way to Joseph. Joseph was of royal heritage, legal royal heritage, directly descended of of King David, in the line of kings. So Joseph was really of royal blood that was lost after the exile. The whole kingship, the whole royal lineage was lost after the exile. What do you mean exile? We're going to get into that when we get into our history and our panorama of the Bible. All right? But after the exile, after they returned, all of these records were kept on the down low. Why? Because, first of all, the Persians were still ruling Judea. Second, after them came the Greeks under Alexander the Great. After them came the Romans. So they were an occupied territory from the time of the exile until Jesus' birth. So the real royal lineage went underground. But the Jews kept very good records, so they knew who was descended of who. And Joseph was a direct descendant of King David. That you find in Matthew's Gospel, first chapter. So verse 5 says he went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged, and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. She gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in bands of cloth, laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Again, familiar sounding story, right? Mary giving birth in the stable, laying him in a manger. There's no room in the inn, you know. Pretty much like the video that we saw, right? Pretty much. All right. Now, what do I want to point out from this? Well, Luke's gospel is very unique in that Luke was a Greek. He wasn't Jewish. So he thought like a Greek. And he was writing to Greek or pagan converts to Christianity. And one of the things that Luke does in his gospel that's completely different than the other three is that he's constantly establishing that Jesus was a real historical character. He wasn't a myth. He wasn't a mythological character like Hercules or Theseus or something like that the Greeks were used to reading about, where the gods like Zeus would come and impregnate a human woman, and then some hero would be born. That's part God and part man, you know, some great hero of Greek mythology that would save a city from the Minotaur or something to that effect. What Luke does is says, no. You may have heard about Jesus, but let me tell you, he wasn't like Hercules or Theseus or any of the other stories you've read. He was a real person because he was born during the time that Augustus was emperor. He was born also at the same time that Quirinius was governor in Syria. So Luke has these historical markers in his gospel to say Jesus was a real historical character, and he lived during the time of these two guys. So if you were reading this in the first century when he wrote it, you would go, oh yes, I remember the time in which, you know, or my mother lived during when Augustus was ruler during Judea. So there would be it would be like us reading the gospel, and it would be saying, in those days, when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, at the time that Duke Majan was governor of California, right? Now you know what I'm talking about. When was Jesus born? In the 1980s, right? Because that's when those two characters were together, right? You see what I mean? So Luke is doing the same thing. If we were reading this in the first century, we would go, oh yeah, I remember that emperor. I remember that governor. Okay, it wouldn't have been that long ago. Yes?
So my question is, were there people still alive when Luke wrote that remembered Jesus?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's where.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Luke wrote his gospel, I'll just say it, probably in the early 60s. Okay? In the early 60s. Probably around 61 or 62 AD, I would suspect. Okay? Maybe as late as 65, but not much more than that. That's my estimation. We'll get into the dating of the Gospels and all of that. So anyway. Now, why is this important? Because these are the historical clues that tell us the time in which, or the year at least, in which Jesus was born. So, and again, I want to emphasize that in verse 1 of Luke 2, we want to emphasize that Jesus was born into real history amongst real historical characters. He's not some myth like I said, Hercules or Theseus or Bellerophon or any of these other Greek myths that these pagans would be thinking he was like. You following me? Okay? Yes. Okay? So, in the Gospels, there are three major historical characters that can help us narrow the focus. They all have to coincide at the same time. This is the first one. This is Caesar Augustus. We know he ruled from 27 BC to 14 AD. Okay? So if the Gospel of Luke was written in 60 AD, this would only have been 50 years ago that this guy was ruling the empire. See, that's not that long ago. So people would have remembered, would have been around enough to remember this guy. Okay? Who else? Well, Matthew 2 tells us of another historical character. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of Herod the king, Magi from the east to Jerusalem came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is one who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So here's another historical character that helps us to figure out when Jesus was born. And again, our history records show that this was Herod the Great, as he is known in history, and he reigned from 37 BC to 4 BC. Do you see that now? So far, we have Herod and Augustus lining up. They lived in the same time frame. Okay? Yes?
Yes.
So we know right now, just with what we have here, Jesus had to have been born between 27 BC and 4 BC. He had to have been born in between that window, because that's where the two overlap. Make sense? Okay. Is there anything else that can help us? Well, yes. Luke mentions this guy, Quirinius, when he was governor of Syria. Now, this is where things get a little strange, because if you look in your history books, most people, most scholars say Quirinius was governor of Syria, but in 6 AD. AD, not BC, AD. What's the problem here? It's outside of the period. He was governor a full 10 years after Herod died. So Jesus couldn't have been born when Quirinius was governor of Syria. What's wrong with this picture? Somebody's wrong. Either our history's wrong or the Gospels are wrong. History's wrong. I'm glad you said that. By the way, here are the pictures of these guys. This is Caesar Augustus. This is a lithograph of Herod the Great, and this is a coin that has the image of Quirinus. So he was these are all real people in real history. That's, if nothing else, understand that Jesus was a real historical person. We didn't make him up, and that's the point that Luke is making in his gospel. He wants you to know that Jesus was a real person living in real time. He's not a myth that we invented. Okay? Now, so far, like I said, this puts the birth of Jesus between 27 and 4 BC. But what do we do with Quirinus? How can Luke and Quirinus help us narrow the time frame and reconcile this apparent contradiction in the gospel account? Well, one solution is to say Luke got it wrong, or at least it's some sort of translation error. Maybe Luke meant to say before Quirinus was governor of Syria. Maybe that's what he intended to say. And maybe it got lost in the translation somewhere. Unfortunately, I can't buy that. I can't buy that. As much as I would like to, we have to be honest with our text in the Gospels. And this is very unlike Luke. Why? Because he made it a point in the very beginning of his Gospel. This is what he says. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully. Did you hear that? Luke was a very precise doctor, not one to go slipshotting through things and get half-truths and rumors. No, he investigated this stuff carefully from the first to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things by which you have been instructed. So Luke's very gospel, from the first 4 verses of